On August 21st, 2015, I was at a customer site and I thought I had a bad case of heartburn. I never get heartburn, but it was very painful. I remember complaining to my coworkers and then taking my glasses off my face and laying them on the table. And then I rubbed my forehead. And the next memory I have is waking up in the hospital from a coma, looking down at my body that was covered in bruises because they'd broken my ribs from CPR. And I remember taking my hand and looking at all the devices I was hooked into, and I ran it across my head and felt a large dent in my head and a big bump on the back of my head. My coworker said that I took my glasses off, laid them on the table, and then I exclaimed, "Oh God," in a loud voice and slumped back in my chair, unconscious. And what had happened is I had a widowmaker heart attack because my large artery in my heart was blocked by a piece of plaque that broke free. They called 911. One of my coworkers went out of the building to direct the people inside, and she actually ended up waving down an ambulance that was passing by that wasn't part of the call. The paramedics came in, saw what had happened, started CPR. They shocked me 5 times on the way to the hospital with no response. 2 more times in the ER, got my heart started again. I had a stent placed. I was induced into a coma to save my brain. Ended up spending, I think, 10 days in the hospital. I don't really remember much of it. It's all like a blur. But I had had a heart attack. I was dead for over 20 minutes. They placed the stent. They saved my life. Following January, we would have a second stent that they told me they knew that I would need, but they didn't think I'd live through the first one. And then the following May, June in 2016, I was diagnosed with an anoxic brain injury because I was dead for too long. Done a lot of podcasts. I've written 3 books. I talked to a lot of survivors, heart attack survivors, TBI survivors. You know, up to that point, I was 54 years old. I'd never broken a bone in my body. I'd never been admitted to a hospital. So it was a hell of a way to start. Anybody who knows me would tell you that I never do things in moderation, and I guess there's your case in point. Over the next several months, I began to recover, but I can tell you about one day in my recovery that was kind of like a big inflection point. And I had to go in for a test, and I think it was an MRI or a cardiogram, probably a cardiogram. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's in my book. And they were going to test my EF. EF is a measure of how well your heart can pump. A normal person has an EF of 55 to 70. And I was told that if my EF was 35, that they wanted me to install an internal defibrillator in my chest, basically. And I hated that idea. I hated it because it sounded like fail. And it was really upsetting. And I was so angry. And when I stopped to think about it, I realized I was angry at myself because I was forced to admit that I was lying to myself for months. I told myself that if I took their drugs and went to cardio rehab, I did my exercises, that everything would go back to normal. And the harsh reality is nothing would go back to normal. My heart is permanently damaged. Part of it's dead. I always like to say, you know, if somebody asks what part, I usually say the part that had any love for Iowa or Creighton. But it was dead because it was blocked for too long. So part of the heart was cut off by oxygen, and it died. And so I have an EF of around, at that time that test was done, it was 40. And my doctor, my cardiologist said, well, you don't have to get the ICD installed, which I was very happy, but I was still had to deal with the realization, or the realization that I'd lied to myself and that everything was going to be fine. And it was about that time, somewhere in there, where I rediscovered something called Stockdale's paradox. Before we go on, I want you to know what this video is about, because I don't want you to waste your time. If all you want to watch is college football stuff, maybe this isn't for you. But this is the story of my survival. This is the story of how I use Stockdale's paradox, the concept of Stockdale's paradox, to survive and recover and keep going. And I've heard so many Nebraska fans say that, well, we can't keep going on like this, and I'm running out of patience, and I can't do this anymore. And to be honest with you, I've talked to a lot of heart attack and TBI survivors, and they say the same things. I know those things are not really closely related, but I do have to kind of relate it to the channel, so there you go. It's also a response to people who think I'm negative, when I don't think I'm really negative at all. And the real honest-to-God truth is my brain won't let me go on without making this video anymore. Every time I sit down and I go, here, I have an idea, my brain goes, oh, you should do this one. Oh, you should do this one. Oh, you should do this one. So in order to shut my brain up, I'm going to do this one, the story of my recovery and survival. I hope you enjoy it, but just so you know what you're in for. So what is Stockdale's paradox? To define that, you have to start with who is Admiral James Stockdale, for whom it's named for. Admiral Stockdale was a Navy flyer that was shot down during the Vietnam War. He was shot down over North Vietnam and captured, and he spent from 1965 to 1972 in captivity as a prisoner of war. He was tortured many times. Reading the account of his story is pretty horrifying, but he lived to get out and come home. A man named Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great. It was a business book published in 2001 about companies that made the leap from good to great. Collins was interested in Stockdale's story because he'd read a book that Stockdale had written with his wife, Sybil, about how they both survived when James Stockdale was in captivity. Collins interviewed Stockdale because he said he'd read his book and he knew the outcome, that Stockdale had come home, but it still filled him with such anxiety. He wanted to know how Stockdale coped with his captivity. During the conversation, Collins asked, who are the ones that didn't make it out of Vietnam, out of captivity? And Stockdale responded, oh, that's easy. The optimists. They were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas, and Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter, and Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. It was then that Stockdale said the lines that later became known as Stockdale's paradox. Stockdale said, you must never confuse the faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be. Collins was confounded somewhat by this answer, and it's not that hard to understand why he was confounded. It's because all the time we hear about, you have to be positive. Oh, be positive about your situation. Just be positive in your attitude, the power of positive thinking. Well, I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of survivors. They, along with me, you deal with chronic pain, you deal with chronic illness. It's impossible to be positive all the time. Recovery doesn't go like this. Recovery goes like this. Just like Nebraska football, rebuilding. And sometimes it goes like this, straight into a hole, straight into an abyss. And that's okay. The important thing is that you don't stay in that abyss. You don't dwell in the darkness. And you have to find out how you're going to get yourself out of that darkness and move on or keep going. That's the part where it means to prevail. And each one of us has to define for ourselves what it is to prevail. We're going to step back for a minute, and I am going to define for you the brutal facts of my reality. I've already talked about EF. My EF, my ejection fraction, is currently just around above 35. I think my cardiologist keeps telling me it's slightly above 35 because he knows how much I hate the idea of an ICD. My heart is permanently damaged, as I've said. What's that mean? That means that my heart at 35 has to beat much harder and pump much harder to do normal things that you would take for granted if you haven't had a heart attack. And that leads to fatigue. The other thing I want you to make you aware of is there's a massive amount of emotional fallout when it comes to heart attack. Most people are familiar with the emotional damage that comes with a cancer diagnosis. It's your mortality punching you in the face. The same thing happens with heart attack. Most people aren't aware of that. As I said, I can point this out. I think every heart attack survivor I've talked to has had this problem where they can't sleep because they look at their bed and they think, if I lie down and go to sleep, I'm never going to wake up again. And it's very hard to get over the fact that your own heart killed you if you had that much damage. Because of my traumatic brain injury, I have chronic headaches. I was doing pretty good for a while, and then about 2 years ago, I started having balance issues and chronic headaches that were pretty painful. And my hope is that that is not degenerative. In other words, it doesn't get worse as time goes on. The TBI leads to a lot of neurofatigue because, like my heart, my brain has to work harder because parts of it are damaged to do mundane tasks. Even sitting in a restaurant with a whole bunch of people talking with all the cognitive input that happens is exhausting. I lost a lot of memories of my life. My kids growing up, my family will be talking about, for example, apparently one time we went to a circus with elephants. I have no memory of that. And it's odd to ask your own family, was I there? And they respond, oh yeah, you were there. And it's not a common occurrence, but it's not completely uncommon either. And it's rather disturbing, to be honest with you. I have so many quirks. I'm not going to list them all, but I'll tell you two more. Math. I can't do math anymore. I can do simple addition, subtraction type stuff, maybe some percentages. I studied math. I studied linear algebra, for God's sakes. I studied quantum mechanics. Now, if I look at a scatter plot or a graph for more than 5 minutes, I end up exhausted and with a headache so bad that I have to sit in a dark room for a while to recover. I hate peanut butter. I don't know why I hate peanut butter. Apparently, I woke up from my coma and I hated peanut butter. My wife said that when I finally was extubated, I had the breathing tube removed, and the nurse came to me for the first time and said, "You can eat now. What would you like to eat?" I responded, "I hate peanut butter. Don't bring me any peanut butter." And then I did that every time they asked me what I wanted to eat for the next several days. I never hated peanut butter. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups is the greatest candy ever made. And now when I look at it, it's nauseating. I hate it, and I have no reason for this. So that's one of the oddities that the TBI has left me with. And the last thing I'll tell you is that TBI, for me, has ripped away every fabric of reality that I had. I was in a coma. I don't remember any of it. There are chunks of my life gone. Other people have to tell me what I did. But the reality is, like I said earlier, I will never be the same again. That's the absolute real reality for me. I'll tie this to Nebraska football, and I'll say you have your casual fans, and then you have your hardcore fans. And the casual fans could just put down their Nebraska football fandom and pick it up later. And the hardcore fans, we're just kind of stuck with this. It's like our arm. You could cut it off, but you really don't want to. Well, how do you survive this? Well, that's where we're going to talk more about what it means to prevail. I don't mean to be rude to Stockdale, but his idea of what prevail meant was pretty easy for him to determine. For others of us, it's not as much. I'll tell you what it is for me. It's very simple. It's to live a happy, fulfilled life. And sometimes that sounds cliche-like. I know a lot of survivors, and this still happens to me 8.5 years after the fact, that you get overwhelmed with anxiety sometimes and you forget to live. And you forget to enjoy simple things. For me, that means I might go jump in a frozen lake again this winter just to challenge myself because I'm kind of foolish that way. The other thing is I made an important list. And I talked about this in my second book for heart attack survivors. And I defined 5 things that were on an important list to me. And what that meant was everything else I could throw away. Like if there's social media stuff that's going on that drives everybody insane, and if it's not a part of my 5 things on my list, I can ignore it. I can ignore world events. I can ignore politics. I can ignore a lot of things because I have a list, a defined list that I've made for myself of things that I really hang on to that are important to me. And I'll tell you real quick, I'll go through them. It's faith, family, friends, customers, and CornNation, believe it or not. Now, the reason, the first, faith, family, those are pretty simple. Some people might say they're cliche. They're not. Customers, because I'm an IT consultant and I'm bound, I want to be bound by integrity that I'm going to do a good job and that I'm going to provide solutions. And that first and foremost are my customers' needs, not my own. Friends should be obvious. CornNation sounds a little corny. The thing is, I enjoy this, and I have a whole bunch of writers and I have a whole bunch of YouTubers that do stuff with me, and I want to be able to treat them well, and I want to be respectful of their needs. And I also want to do a good job for the people that watch this channel. I enjoy it, and I enjoy the live stuff. It's my socialization now, and I like to entertain people, and maybe every once in a while I might be educational. I'll tell you one more personal item. When I was a kid, I used to read every sci-fi novel I could get my hands on. Bradbury, Asimov, Philip K. Dick, you name it, I read them. And someday I fancied myself to be a sci-fi novelist. Well, I wrote for 20 years in the computer industry, and I got pretty well known in my little corner of the world, but I never wrote a novel. Now it's 20 years almost in sports, and I've still never written a novel. It's still out there as a goal, and not just to say I wrote a novel, but to write something that somebody might want to read. So there's that. Brad, since I need to tie this to Nebraska football, prevail for Nebraska football and Nebraska sports in general, I think, would be to win championships. I don't think coaches present it like that. They present it as get better day by day, because if they focus on championships, there's too much pressure there. But if they can just focus on today and focus on being better than they were yesterday, that's a pretty good idea of keeping yourself going. And it's a good way to get yourself out of bed, and it's a good way to get yourself out of a hole. And there's nothing wrong with staying there for a day, for a little while. Again, don't stay there, because it will destroy you. And I'm not talking about a pre-game, if we die, we die metaphorical death. I'm talking about really, it will destroy you. You will forget to live. You will forget to enjoy yourself. So you have to find things to keep going. Let me wrap this up. Stockdale's paradox is about facing brutal reality, being honest with yourself. It's not about covering things up just to be positive. And it's also about prevailing, which means you find something to hold on to. And I'll tell you one more story to end this. Earlier, I mentioned that I woke up in the hospital from the coma with a dent in my head. I felt the dent. There it is. There's a dent in my head. And we have never discovered what caused this dent in my head. And I literally wrote a short book about it that's up on Amazon called The Mystery of the Dent in My Head, about what I tried to do to find out why I have a giant dent in my head. And I'm not going to tell you all of it. You can go read the book, or you can ask me on a live stream some questions, but it's an odd thing to tell people. Yes, I have a dent in my head, and I don't know how it got there. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you for watching this. If you made it this far, I appreciate your support on this channel. If I get this out there and publish it, you know what? I can go on with other stuff because my brain wouldn't let me otherwise. Take care of yourselves and go Big Red.